Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And you know, there's one thing that is, to me, just a given. And that is that this ANC government talks BS. You know what I'm talking about? So when they talk about the number of confirmed coronavirus cases, the figures they're giving out are BS. Yeah, bullshit. Why do I say that? Well, according to them, the last couple of days, the virus has kind of tapered off, and this is just after they've gone into lockdown. Now, isn't that sweet and dandy? But guess what? Every other country in the world that's got 1,000 plus coronavirus cases, straight line up. It's still going straight up. Because that's what happens. So what you've got right now in South Africa is the ANC government handing out BS figures when it comes to the number of confirmed cases. And we know that on top of that, they're not testing enough people because they don't have enough test kits. So there's a whole lot of BS going on in the government. And this is absolutely incredibly dangerous when you consider we now have infections in several of the big townships in South Africa, where living conditions are appalling. They live cheek to jowl. The infection's going to go like that through them. We're going to see the fruits of the ANC's lockdown by the end of this month. The end of April I'm talking about. April starts for you in a few minutes, so consider this to be April. Okay, and we'll be talking more about that shortly. Those of us trying to model the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic should try to humble. There is more we don't know than we do. Anyone who claims to know what the infection or mortality rate for this disease is either deluded or dishonest. Absolutely true. In South Africa, in the townships, you've got a high percentage of HIV and TB. That's a perfect hunting ground for the coronavirus. The mortality rate is going to be a lot higher in South Africa. Just give it time. At the moment, it's mainly in the white community, but once it starts spreading in the black community who say that, hey, only the whites can get the coronavirus, not going to be good. But with time-tested scientific analysis, some things are predictable. On the 17th of April, after 3 weeks of lockdown, the sun will arise in Cape Town, and we will still be at the start of a COVID-19 breakdown, which is why they're now talking about extending this to 90 days. They extend this to 90 days, guess what? You won't have an economy in South Africa. There'll be nothing left. You know, here in Australia, they're putting out nearly $1 trillion Australian dollars, which is like 10 trillion or over 10 trillion rand, to make sure that the economy bounces along and recovers. South Africa just does not have that kind of financial clout. It'll be flat out trying to get 10 billion rand together now that it's junk. This is a perfect storm. I talked about this before it all happened. Although our current 3-week lockdown will temporarily suppress transmission in the South African epidemic, it will not eradicate it. And if we go back to business as usual, we will have endured the lockdown for nothing. That's exactly right. That's why I suggested before, when the first coronavirus cases appeared in South Africa, is they should just go on, treat it as business as usual. Just let the coronavirus spread through the community. It's going to spread through the community anyway, according to the Minister of Health, who says that something like 70% of the South African population will get the coronavirus. So why have a friggin' lockdown? Why not use the resources to protect the elderly, isolate them, and let everybody go ahead? Because they seem to be fairly protected against any serious implications from the coronavirus. But no, they shut down and kill the whole economy. You know how they've done it? Because the rest of the world has done it. They can't think outside the square. South Africa is a special case. Not every country in the world has huge townships like South Africa does, where it's a breeding ground for the coronavirus. Usually viral outbreaks like flu peak and subside long before everyone gets infected. The network for transmission becomes thinned, and transmission just can't be sustained. The thinning has many potential contributing factors. For most viral infections, people acquire substantial immunity from infection, so once they recover, sometimes very quickly, they no longer contribute to the spread. Of course, people may also adapt their behavior if they see a severe outbreak around them, but even with changes in behavior, there are natural reasons for epidemics to die out. This pruning of the transmission tree, however, relies on a substantial fraction of people getting at least a brush with the infection, and it is from the study of seasonal flu and similar viruses that people have been circulating some alarming estimates of how many people might contract the new coronavirus in South Africa. Indeed, a scarily large number of people would need to be infected for there to be a collective herd immunity. That would make any residual transmission dwindle away harmlessly. Even in severe COVID-19 outbreaks like in Wuhan, China, only about 1% of the local population was ever infected before draconian measures pretty much shut down transmission. And what I should say here, a lot of people have been talking about 5G and whether 5G is actually brought on, or the coronavirus is brought on by the actual 5G technology. I'm sorry, guys, I don't buy into that. I just don't buy into that. What I do buy into, though, however, is this draconian Big Brother situation where those 5G towers and being spread around the country, it's such a powerful network that it can actually track and trace you. And that's what they did in China. What they did in China to actually help control the spread of the coronavirus is every single person who was confirmed infected, they had on a computer, on a database. They could make sure that that person stayed at home. If they left the home, an alert went out and the police went and took those guys into custody. That's how it worked. They were tracking and tracing every citizen that had been impacted by the coronavirus. That is where you no longer have any privacy at all. That's the Chinese government. And they're talking about doing the same thing in South Africa now. While restrictions are now being eased, the population is almost as susceptible, we're talking about the Chinese population, to reignition of the epidemic as it ever was, and any reintroduction of infection to Wuhan would be just about as dangerous as the initial outbreak. So the question is, what do we do after the 16th of April? This is a political, not a purely technical question, though there are some technical aspects to understand what will happen as we try to get out of a strict lockdown to do something more sustainable. I don't think epidemiologists necessarily have the insights of creativity to come up with the answers. Well, it's not their trade. But we can suggest some of the important things we will have to consider and debate. Between quasi-incarceration and going back to how things were, there is a wide spectrum of measures and an infinite scope for creativity. Now, look, I've got to tell you guys, things will never be the same again in South Africa. One way or the other, things will change, just like they did post-1994. We will call this post-coronavirus. And one of the most damaging things that will happen after this lockdown and the coronavirus is eventually kind of suppressed is the damage this has done to the ailing South African economy. Tens of thousands of businesses are going to close down. The unemployment rate is going to go right through the roof. And just to put the spanner in the works, the rand is now junk, which means that the South African government no longer can just go and print money and spend money, etc., etc. This is where I have a huge concern about the impact on those SASSA payments. You know, the social security payments in South Africa. Consider this fact. Let's say 1 or 2 million people go on to unemployment. Imagine the impact that's going to have when it comes to SASSA. especially now the rand is junk. It can't work. The economy is absolutely stuffed in South Africa. And if you'd had the adults in the room control your situation, it would be a totally different basket of eggs. But now what you've got is a basket case full of absolute trash. The legacy of the ANC. Anyway, let's get back to the story. If there is a rapid escalation in cases or hospitals begin to get overwhelmed, which will only take about 10 people, do we enter another lockdown? How many lockdowns can we endure before unemployment and the slowdown in the bare-bone basics of the economy become even worse than a massive but transient epidemic? That is what I had proposed before they did this. How do we conceive, implement and monitor meaningfully distinguishable levels of social distancing, and how do we step back cautiously but with some urgency from the brink of total stagnation? In South Korea, there is continuous mass testing. Over 400,000 tests are being conducted, compared to about 35,000 in South Africa. The populations are, by the way, similar in size. As soon as infected people are identified, they have to go into isolation until they're recovered. This has helped keep the epidemic manageable and maintain standards of care for those who experience acute illness, so mortality rates are low. How do we adapt this to our informal settlements, infrastructure and finances? We need rapid, simple, cheap and reliable tests to become available here and fast. Now, the problem here is quite simple, is that you've got these taxis still going out, taking passengers, putting them in this cocoon, which is a perfect way to actually spread the virus. And it's still happening right now in South Africa, all over South Africa. This is the genius of the ANC government, because the taxis are the prime way that this coronavirus is going to be spread right through the community. And yet, because the taxi bosses are so powerful in South Africa, well, we'll look the other way. Should people who can work from home continue to do so by default? Should restaurants remain closed except for takeout? Can we encourage online grocery shopping? Do airports remain open only for essential travel and goods? What public transport rules will be instituted? How do we even begin to implement social distancing in high-density informal settlements? Or could this epidemic be the impetus to finally address the housing crisis, or indeed the land question? Perhaps a handful of schools can implement sustainable distance learning, but this is impossible for township schools and even schools in middle-class areas. Perhaps we have to accept that the school year must be cancelled and that a cohort of children will matriculate 12 to 18 months later, or whenever the pandemic has passed. But without schools and feeding schemes, many children will go hungry unless something creative is done. Now, I've just put up a video on the 2020 channel where you can see the homeless are being pushed into this stadium, overcrowded. They'll be spreading the virus amongst each other if someone's got it there. No question at all about that. This is to try and limit the spread of the virus. So they push all these homeless people in one confined space together. That is, again, pure genius. Pure genius. They're doing more damage than good, this ANC government. They are just absolutely clueless. Alternatively, if we restart schools soon, can the youth show us how they wish to adapt their environment to take care of their futures? Perhaps the main benefit of the lockdown is that it is giving intensive care units an opportunity to prepare for a spike in cases. Well, during April, you just watch. It's not rocket science, guys, and I'm not a prophet. Just watch what happens. The impressive crisis-driven adaptations we have seen in other countries may not be replicated in South Africa, but it's clear the trenches of this proverbial war are the high-care settings of formal healthcare facilities. The pressure COVID-19 puts on health systems is not primarily about people dying. The challenge is that many of those who become really ill can, in principle, benefit hugely from effective care, but they will not get much care if the system is overwhelmed. Well, the public hospitals in South Africa were overwhelmed before this virus raised its ugly head. So it's going to be absolutely terminal. That's why I say to people, just don't even go to a public hospital. It's a death trap. A virtual who's who of local economists have written a compelling letter to President Ramaphosa with key proposals to mitigate the economic fallout of both the epidemic itself and the ongoing and coming social countermeasures. Engaging seriously and transparently with these proposals is now a matter of great urgency. Look, I think before the 16th of April, you're going to start having shops being looted. I think you're going to have trucks being stopped on the road and looted. You're going to have a complete breakdown of the emergency services in South Africa. It's going to become anarchy. And I think you're going to have far more SANDF violence against the population. I think you're going to have shootings. I think it's going to break down completely. This is a recipe for disaster in South Africa right now. I just don't see a way out. I'm sorry, guys, I just don't see a way out. If we just go back to normal after the 16th of April, then all that will have brought at some pretty awful costs, extraordinary costs, for the most vulnerable in our society, is a few weeks' delay of terrible disaster, but a continuous takedown or lockdown will obviously also have devastating effects, especially on people living in informal settlements, who are somehow expected to stay confined to their shacks 24 hours a day, except to stand in long queues for social grants and groceries. And of course, consider this fact, that a lot of people are literally going to starve. And when people get to that point of starvation, what have they got to lose? That's the question. Nothing. Jobs have evaporated. Couples are stuck in their homes with desperate, disgruntled parents, and children are forbidden to run around outside unless they live in the plush suburbs and have gardens. This seems almost like pointless cruelty, a heavy-handed overreaction to the fear that more nuanced social distancing will somehow necessarily fail. We are facing extremely difficult times and questions, and we surely won't find the right answers to them, except in a few cases, and even then probably only with hindsight. But we need to begin to explore these questions now and make choices even before the end of the lockdown, so that the next steps are neither rank guesswork nor political expedience. Well, guys, look, I don't know how else to put it, but the ANC government are incompetent. They're trying to take on lockdown, which is a first world format of preventing the virus from spreading, and they're using third world strategies, i.e. people use taxis where they're going to pick up and spread the virus, put all the homeless into one little confined space where there's no social distancing. One has a virus, it's going to spread right through the whole group. They have got no clue. These are just two examples of dozens of how this virus is going to spread regardless of this so-called lockdown. All right, guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. Above all, please stay safe.